of the panel.
Deputy Karen Wilson, Vice Chair.
Deputy Max Andrews.
Thank you. We've got apologies from Deputy Morel today. The purpose of this hearing is that we're doing a review into the ferry contracts, or the concession agreement as it's otherwise called, between Government of Jersey and the authorities, ports authorities, and DFTS on the other hand. And it's a topic of interest, as I'm sure you can imagine. So, Minister, we'll just hand over to you to introduce yourself for the record.
Yeah, Deputy Kirsten Morel, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
Richard Corrigan, Chief Officer, Department for the Economy.
Thomas Brackenbury, Sector Lead for Aviation and Maritime, Department for the Economy.
Thank you. Thanks again for coming in. So we'll just launch straight in. You'll be aware of our review and the terms of reference, I trust. Minister, could you just give us an overview of, so DFTS is now coming up almost to its year anniversary. Could you just talk us through how you think DFTS has been performing, specifically in the context of the concession agreement?
Okay. Yeah, it's still obviously very early days. The FDS have, as of earlier this week, completed 10 months service, so still a fair way to go to the end of their first year. And yes, as was to be expected, there were some difficulties at the startup, but they did get through them, and they also, in that particularly the first 2-week period, showed that they have the contingency capabilities. So they had an issue with one of the vessels, but they were able to bring in contingency to cover that off. So people still travelled, as has been the case previously. So there was that difficulty. They also obviously, because of the late nature of the award of the concession agreement, they also had less of a run-in time, and so from a marketing perspective as well, I think we suffered there as well. So there were difficulties. There's no question, but I think now they are very much up and running. They are engaging in our quarterly meetings. We had one very recently, as specified by the concession agreement. They've also set up other subcommittees of that, such as the marketing subcommittee, and they are setting up a freight subcommittee as we speak. And the indications for this second year, or still completing their first year of service, but for 2026 are good. Obviously, we won't get the figures until after the 31st of January, but it looks like sailings passengers from St Malo are up 40% this month compared to last year for this month. And again, this time last year it was still Condor in service. So against Condor's performance in 2025, DFDS is set to be 40% up on their St Malo sailings in January and 20% up on their UK sailings in January, which is good. Their forward bookings for 2026, they have already booked more group bookings than they did for the whole of 2025, and they're, as I understand, they're very happy with where they are in terms of bookings. We're talking in excess of 70,000 people already booked for the year ahead, and we're only in week 4 of the year. I know from a tourism perspective, the year ahead is looking good, with every month for forward bookings for hotels looking higher in every month except May, which is 1% down for forward bookings. Every other month is between 2 and 4 or even 5% up for all the other months. So we're looking in a much stronger position for 2026.
Thank you. I think that's good, useful background generally. I suppose one question arising from that is that will you also be looking to compare this year's figures for DFTS specifically with 2024, 2023? I think you accept probably 2025 as an anomalous year for various reasons. So will you be looking at different benchmarks?
So that's one of the reasons why I stated that this time last year it was still Condor in service. So that was the standard Condor service. But actually, if you look at the January figures for 2025 and 2024 and 2023, they're very similar. They're around 2,500 to about 2,900. DFDS, my understanding is they're up against all of those 3 years.
Thank you. So Minister, the concession agreement identifies its primary aim as delivering a reliable, efficient and sustainable ferry service that meets the transportational needs of Jersey residents and visitors. To what extent do you believe the agreement and the operator are currently fulfilling this aim in practice?
So they were given some leeway In terms of the setup, so 2025, some of the measurements in the contract, were kind of waived for 2025, and I know the officers can go into that, but that makes sense given the lack of run-in they had, particularly from a marketing perspective. But against, I think, all other metrics, they're doing very well in terms of delivering what they said they would deliver. So we have the 6 and 5 freight sailings, which is, is it 6 dedicated freight sailings and 5 road pax freight sailings, I think, which compared to the Condor one was 5 and 5 as their minimum standard. So the minimum standard has gone up for the amount of freight, but the actual lane meterage, both in off-peak and peak seasons, is greater under the minimum service agreement now than it was under the previous one. That's no criticism of the previous incumbent. The agreement we had provided for less lane meterage than we do now. So Jersey is far better positioned from a freight perspective. And obviously all that freight, we're in excess of 16,000 lane meters of freight a week. In low season, that's 15,000 lane meters a week. I believe that in the previous agreement, it's something like 12,500 lane meters a week. And so from that perspective, we're being served far better than we have been before in terms of freight and next capacity. Please step in if there's, sorry, just in case there was anything.
That's fine. Yeah. We may get onto this later. Obviously, some of the adjectives, the criteria I read to you there about the ferry service being reliable, efficient and sustainable. Clearly affordable is not in there as a requirement. You can perhaps speak to that.
I think sustainable covers that off.
I suppose the question of affordability and efficiency, these might be themes that we come back to, is we're mindful of your comments recently in the media about the new boats. I think you said they have to be paid for somehow, and of course it's customers ultimately who will pay for any upgrades in the service.
As I said, whether you're an airline, whether it's EasyJet buying a new plane, or whether it's Condor buying a new boat, or DFDS buying a new boat, ultimately it's the customers who pay for those new vessels. The contract has been set up to ensure that, the revenues coming in are used to invest in new vessels. That's a brand new part of the concession agreement. If you look at the previous concession agreement, there was nothing around that in there. All it talked about was making sure that any new vessels were on a kind of like-for-like basis. It didn't talk about how they would be financed. I think it is, as you've referred, Chair, to media recently, I think there was some very interesting reporting by ITV News recently, where the graphs that it provides show that DFDS is providing better pricing than Brittany Ferries Condor in many, many areas. That's the very graphs that they put on the article itself. And so it's very odd that they lead with a headline which is against one particular firm out of those two. So my view is there seems to be a significant distortion in the amount of focus on DFDS as opposed to the amount of focus on
in terms of the
Brittany
pricing.
Ferries. In terms of all aspects, to be honest with you, we don't hear very much about Brittany Ferries.
I suppose we're looking at DFDS. We can't look
absolutely.
at Brittany Ferries, but I think it's natural for the public to compare both what's gone before and also maybe what's going on in Guernsey. Yeah, I'm going to just pass over to Deputy Wilson because I think there are some questions perhaps around performance monitoring that are relevant. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, if I could just start with the monitoring committee. Could you just, for the public, explain who is that monitoring committee?
Yeah, so the monitoring committee consists of officers from my department, consists of Ports of Jersey and the Harbour Master, and also the FDS are part of that as well, but Richard, you might be different.
Well, that's it. So I chair the committee, Ports of Jersey leadership, including the Harbour Master, and then we have senior management from DFDS, both locally and from Copenhagen as well.
Thank you. And the Island Authority?
Well, the Island Authority is the government, ultimately, but the concession agreement itself is a tripartite agreement, the government, the Harbour Master and DFDS.
Okay, thanks. So it was just for the public to understand that. And can you just explain to us how often you meet and what sort of monitoring arrangements you've set up so far?
Yeah, so there's a structured programme of quarterly meetings. So there's almost a senior committee that covers that everything aggregates to in terms of if there are any particular difficulties, but then it breaks down into a series of subcommittees around sort of operational matters, passenger growth and marketing, and infrastructure and investment. But they would then aggregate up to the quarterly meeting. So we would receive a slide deck that covers all of those aspects, any salient points arising from the committee, and if there are any concerns then that we want to express either to DFDS or indeed them to us, that's the right mechanism for doing it. In terms of the performance data for sailings is now on gov.je, so there's information there quarter by quarter showing the actual level of delays and cancellations across all the routes. That's something that we've not had before.
And are you intending to produce a much broader suite of performance metrics for the public to have a look at? Or is this the sort of performance framework that you will monitor the contract against?
So I think the public are looking for, punctuality, reliability of the services, principally. So cancellations and delays is the primary information. Separately, we receive financial reporting from DFDS around the fare structure. You'll see from the concession agreement, certainly the redacted version doesn't have the minimums, the maximums and so on in there for commercial sensitivity reasons, but we receive pricing information from DFDS against that to ensure that we're policing the perimeter of the fare structure, to ensure that passengers aren't being charged outside the margins, and also that the mean average fare is consistent with where they tendered as well.
We never previously had insight, into the mean fare structure. All we really saw was the margins ourselves by looking at it. I believe the previous agreement also said that I think the only real kind of touch point was a quarterly provision of the RACHI, the return on capital employed, from Condor as it was. And I'm not sure that was ever really provided on a quarterly basis either. So from a monitoring perspective, if you were to compare the current agreement versus the previous agreement, the level of monitoring is massively higher. Massively higher.
And then we also see full financials at the route level. So we see the profit and loss account in effect for the Jersey routes. And then obviously as a group that's in the public domain, they have transparency of their financial reporting as well, which some other providers that tendered clearly don't have.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to what the Minister said before about his view about how things are operating, what's the data telling you about the way in which the contract is operating and the way in which the operator itself is performing?
It will be best for officers to answer this because I'm not part of that quarterly meeting.
So the information's in the public domain in terms of cancellations and delays. I think as the Minister has said, there were teething issues with getting some vessels mobilised. There were some issues on board. There was a substitute vessel, so there was a RoPax vessel used, Jersey San Malo for a period of time rather than the high-speed craft. So that would have led to obviously delays in sailings and a different timetabling for that period. So there were some initial complexities. But fundamentally now we're seeing a largely compliant schedule, both in terms of freight and in terms of passenger movements as well, in terms of complying with the contract.
Certainly.
And others may beg to differ, others may make comparisons elsewhere. But I think it's very important for people to understand that Jersey is a tidal port, so heavily impacted there. Also the positioning of the port in terms of prevailing winds is much more limited for vessel movements than St Peter Port in Guernsey, for example. And also anything above 35 knots of wind, and there would be no berthing of the vessels into St Helier Harbour. So at 30 knots it requires a tug, at 35 knots there's no berthing. So there's much more difficulty around the vessels berthing and arriving into and departing from St Helier Harbour than there is with the other ports on the route network that DFDS serves, or indeed the other Channel Island operator.
So taking into...
So just quickly,
Sorry.
their reliability figures, which like you say are publicly available, show a decent level of reliability. There's no question. There's no big, especially if you put that first month aside, after that, the reliability is very good.
Okay, so, taking into consideration all of those factors, are you saying that you've designed your KPIs around those particular issues so that they take into account all of those sort of scenarios you've just outlined?
Yeah, the critical aspect for us is that when a cancellation's happening for any reason, that there's a notification process that the operator has to go through. So they would notify Jersey Harbours of an intended cancellation or delay to services. They provide the supporting information that they're making that decision upon, and that's looked at not to challenge it back and say you must sail, because any decision to sail is always with the master of the vessel. So even DFDS chief executive in Copenhagen can't say you must sail. It's always a decision of the master of the vessel. But to make sure that the information they're using is reasonable based on everything that's available at that point in time. And also we're looking at a 48-hour window for DFDS to make that decision, which the weather may not come through quite as badly, in which case people might say, well, why didn't they sail? But at 48 hours, that's considered to be the most reasonable point to have an accurate weather forecast for the whole of the route, not just where the wind's blowing off the edge of the island, and also to provide ample notice to freight users and to customers in terms of changing their travel plans.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So are you saying that over the last 12 months, if you were to look at the trends that are emerging, do you see some continuity of performance, or do you see it improving over time?
We're converging on improved performance, and performance is consistent
And at
with
what point
what we
do you
expect
think
in the
that
contract.
at what point do you think that improvement started to kick in?
So I think once they got the vessels, the originally intended vessels onto the routes, that made a big difference. Then it's a case of other operational factors beginning to fall away. So the need to take on pilots, for example, at St Helier and at St Malo and at Portsmouth, again, are further delaying factors in terms of slowing up the vessel ahead of time. And also they had complications, as I say, with like tidal movements and so on. If they were in any way delayed, there's some challenges there. The route to St Malo, did they go over the top or to the east or to the west on their journey there? Those are all things that the masters of the vessels have become more and more familiar with. So I think we're now in a position in 2026 that we have an operator that's providing the level of punctuality, resilience and reliability that we're seeking. But as I say, we monitor that closely, and the figures are there in the public domain to promote public confidence rather than people just having their own perceptions.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, whilst we understand that weather is necessarily temperamental, the tidal movements are well known. Jersey's not just become tidal, so can you explain why tidal considerations have been an issue?
Yeah, so if the vessel's delayed in any other way, then it may fall then outside the tidal window to be able to come in, to discharge and to leave again on that same tide.
But that's if there's a delay already. It doesn't explain why there
Absolutely, but it can mean a delay, it gets exacerbated
yeah.
and becomes even worse. It may delay, until the next tide potentially. Also, then once you're out of sync, you've got pressure on berths now at St Malo with one berth only in operation, and at Portsmouth as well. Portsmouth is a busy port, both with commercial movements and Royal Navy movements, and that sometimes affected the timetable as well. So this is a complex process. It's not just there's always a berth available and that there's always a high tide to be able to bring the vessel in the right conditions.
And the reference you made to tides was about exacerbating delays.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying.
So given all of that, and given that the information is in the public domain, Minister, can you talk to us about where your area or your level of satisfaction is with the current performance against the contract? And are there any particular areas where you have concerns that it's weaker in terms of its performance that you will be focusing in on over the next quarter?
So, as I said, I wasn't in the most recent quarterly meeting, so there have been figures given which I haven't seen yet. But the figures that I was last given about a month ago about the actual reliability and the punctuality of the sailings, I thought was very good. I think in the second quarter, there's only a couple of delays, and that kind of carried through. So from that perspective, I've been pleased. I'm very pleased with the replacement of the Arrow with the Caesarea Trader. That's made a big difference to freight turnarounds and helped freight be on time. So freight is in a much better place now than it was when we had the Arrow, which the Arrow is a vessel which has been used for contingency in Jersey for decades. So it's no stranger to our waters. Condor used it as their contingency when their vessels are in maintenance and things like this. But it's one of those boats which it can do the job, but it doesn't do it brilliantly, and it takes longer, etc., to turn around. Things like this, it doesn't carry as much. So the fact that DFDS invested in the Caesarea Trader in order to move on the Arrow, because the Arrow wasn't cutting the mustard, so to speak, I think again showed their commitment to the routes. It has made a big difference to freight, and it's meant that their freight sailings are now much better from a reliability and punctuality perspective as well.
Okay, so are there any areas at this moment in time that you have anxiety or concern about in terms of underperformance against the agreement that you have with people?
I'm trying to think of where I've been shown underperformance. I don't, and this is where I do look to officers. If you've just been told something about underperformance, please do let me know. The main underperformance was financial, and so that was in 2025. That was particularly on the southern route to St Malo and back. We knew that would happen regardless of who was chosen, DFDS or Condor, didn't matter, because Guernsey were always going to have, under the joint tender process, a direct sailings from St Malo to Guernsey, which they didn't have in the previous agreement. And that meant that there was always going to be traffic which no longer came to Jersey, but was going to go to Guernsey directly. So we knew that there was going to be a hit there. But that said, I know that there ultimately that did lead to a financial underperformance in 2025, which is something that the whole point of that quarterly meeting is that you can then make adjustments in the contract. These levers that we've talked about, everything from pricing to delaying investment, and 3 other levers, that's exactly what they're there for. What I've made it very clear is that there is a large marketing effort that needs to take place. So before jumping to a lever, what's really important is that the marketing is in place to try to attract those customers back. We were always going to lose customers to Guernsey. That's fine, and I'm really pleased that Guernsey has those customers. It's right that Guernsey has direct St Malo Guernsey sailings. That's why we were happy to put it in. But it was always going to be a loss to Jersey's economy as a result. Our job is to win customers back and win new customers to visiting Jersey. So there's going to be a big marketing effort. Visit Jersey and DFDS are both aligned to really push into St Malo this year.
So
And
do you
we're
have
gonna
some
see that
sort of
happen.
forecasts and some predictions as to what it is you would actually expect to see or wish to see that would actually address that financial return?
Yes. What I've wanted to see is a heavier point in marketing. I think one of the other aspects that was delayed last year was marketing, particularly in France, and the group side as well. That was affected by it. We know that DFDS have, as I said earlier, they have more group booked now than they did for the whole of 2025. So I can kind of in my heart believe that they've solved their marketing for groups. That's really good. The marketing for St Malo itself and France will really kick in March, and it remains to be seen whether that works or not, but I'm very hopeful. And certainly from St Malo's perspective itself as a port, it really wants to see the Jersey route grow. And so I'm really pleased that St Malo is behind growth in the Jersey route as well.
And just what we're also seeing is an operator that's listening. So, there were some early challenges with freight, partly around the Arrow, partly just around a new stevedoring arrangement at Portsmouth. So DFDS invested in, more tugs being available, more staff being available for that stevedoring operation at Portsmouth to provide a faster discharge and turnaround of the vessel. The Levante jet, some of the customer feedback was that she felt a bit tired on board in terms of the seats and so on. When she dry docks over this winter period, there's a significant investment going into upgrading the passenger space on Levante jet. So we're seeing an operator that's listening to feedback and responding to it and wants to do the right thing by the island. They buy significant amounts of local produce in terms of the onboard food that's sold. So there's a number of things that they are doing that, from our perspective, build the value and the relationship with the island and deliver the service that islanders want to see.
And I'm sorry, I have to say, I cannot tell you how important that is. We have a partner who sits down, talks and listens. I'm really sorry that was not the case over the past few years. We did not have a partner who listened. And that is now changed. And I cannot understate the value of that.
Okay, I mean, I think, sorry, if I may just finish these 2 areas. The feedback seems to be on the quality of the experience that people are having. So what you're talking about is that there is an operator who's listening to that customer experience. And it says in the KPIs that within the concession agreement, there are references to passenger call centre, call answer rate and passenger email response rate. But we've received a number of submissions indicating that there is no customer service available in the island. So how are you getting that feedback? How is that happening?
So that's not accurate fundamentally. First and foremost, DFDS has a properly manned office down at St Helier Harbour during the course of the day and around the sailings. They're accessible. We have a litany of stories that the harbour master could tell you of cancellations from the previous operator, and no Condor staff being available to deal with them, and Ports of Jersey staff then having to arrange hotels for island visitors because the ferry operator had just gone missing. That's not acceptable in terms of the visitor experience, and it's not acceptable in terms of the operator that we want to do business with. So DFDS do have staff on hand to be able to deal with those things personally. Also, they have their call centre operations. They are calling customers in advance of sailings to see if there are any special needs that the customer has ahead of their sailing, so those can be properly attended to. And there is also an overflow arrangement from the call centre at peak times to overflow into customer service staff that are here in St Helier that are able to take those calls and to respond to them as well.
So there's a 24-hour response available.
We are cited on that. We do collect that data as a set of non-critical KPIs as well. So the percentage of call centre calls answered, emails responded to within 48 hours, website availability, complaints responded to within less than a month. These are all built into our reporting regime, and we're cited on the associated metrics.
So
And
far,
that's the issue, which is I was talking about before, is given that there has been a big sort of message about transparency and engaging with the passenger on this, are those metrics and is that performance reporting actually there so that the public can see and have confidence in?
We do have that. And what we're working with the FDS on is setting appropriate benchmarks around a net promoter score. I think there's lots of anecdotal feedback, either in chats or on social media and so on. We would strongly encourage people to fill out the questionnaires that the FDS may give them either on board or as a post-sailing questionnaire request that comes through by email, because then the data is compiled in a proper fashion statistically and presented back to us that gives that richer data around what the net promoter score is.
Yeah, I think that's the message, which is the public want to see those performance measures and how, and you know, what kind of feedback
they need to fill out the questionnaires. We really want people to fill out the questionnaires, and that gives us the best handle on service rather than anecdote. It collects it then in a much more structured way, which would be really helpful.
Okay, and finally from me...
Would you like me to read a couple of the stats, which I hadn't seen? But
no, it's okay.
No, that's fair enough.
Just for time, but thank you for that.
There are no reds. That's what I would say. They're all green and orange.
Okay, thank you. We'll have a look at that. Finally, from me, there are sorts of variable KPIs, obviously, that you can build into this. And what we wanted to know is, you know, based on what those performance metrics are giving you around the experience that people are having and the functionality that's built into the contract, is there scope within the concession agreement to vary those? And is there also scope within the agreement to modify the performance requirement that you have of the operator?
Could you give an example of what sort of modifications?
Well, I'm picking out really in terms of what you've said in the concession agreement, which is that only the service levels of the variable KPIs should be subject to review. So what we're trying to understand is, what do you mean by that? Does that mean that you can vary the performance of the contract subject to the feedback that you're getting, or are there other levers, i.e. financial or extraneous issues that may well affect the performance of the contract, that you can actually create the variation to that concession agreement? And how transparent will that be? And when might we see something like that happen?
So I think certainly if we vary the contract, you know, it's only right that contract as varied goes back into the public domain, just as the current concession agreements in the public domain. So that gives the public a view of what we have contractually agreed with the operator. You know, we should, by the end of 2028, see the first of the new vessels on the routes. That'll be a brand new investment. We would expect to see a correlating pickup in the net promoter score for the routes that vessel is serving, commensurate with that kind of investment. So we would be looking to move those things up. And DFDS are in exactly the same position. They want to keep stretching, keep delivering, keep getting better. It's not there's your vessels, it's a take it or leave it service. And I think the investment that's been made in Levante Jet during this dry docking season is a testimony to that. They're receiving the feedback. The feedback was critical of some of that soft product aspect on Levante Jet, which is why they're making the investment over the winter to improve that for the season ahead.
I mean, so far, I mean, and as I say, I know we're only 10 months in, we've only had a couple of quarterly meetings, but so far, the FDS are giving us every indication that when it comes to something like, hold on a sec, we need to discuss the KPIs around net promoter scores, for example, we think they're too low. You're in a sense too easily passing them, something like this. Every indication has been given by DFDS they are happy to engage in those sorts of conversations about changing where we need to change. I'm really pleased. Mr. Parker showed me just about a month ago, or earlier this month it was, their net promoter scores. So I think it is really interesting. And certainly for the first 6 months, they were getting poor net promoter scores. Then I'm going off memory, so it was about 6 months in, say September, October time, that sort of thing. Their net promoter scores changed significantly.
Can you tell us what is a net promoter score, just for those?
So net promoter score is effectively it's feedback from your customers about whether they would recommend a service onwards to somebody else. Yeah. And I know in Jersey, Visit Jersey always tell me, in Jersey we have a net promoter score of over 70, which is classed as outstanding or excellent, those sorts of things. So even net promoter score of 50 is doing well, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And certainly their net promoter scores that I saw, I couldn't give you the numbers, but they had all swung from either negative or 0 to heavily positive across the board, which is really good.
Okay, we'll move on. We'll move on, if that's all right. Thank you, Deputy. I'm going to jump to an issue about scheduling. So 3 of the biggest complaints that we've received as a panel during this submissions process is that the first is around scheduling, particularly about the length of trips to Saint-Malo. The second is around pricing, saying that it's too expensive and that there's no frequent travellers. So actually the report we heard from the media did seem to chime with a lot of our comments that we've had. And the third was quality of boats, which I think you've touched on already. If I can also add that it's not just members of the public who seem to have disquiet, but I did notice the comments of your Chief Minister, or indeed our Chief Minister, depending on which way
I think
you
he's
look at
shared.
it. Although we're
It's
not
a shared resource, as we like to say.
we're not ministers, of course. The Chief Minister said that he'd like to see the FDS to speed up the boat to Saint-Malo and just try a bit harder to work with Brittany Ferries to provide more comprehensive inter-island links. If we just look at the scheduling for now, Minister, we note that in December last year, DFDS announced that it would be able to offer an enhanced sailing schedule to and from France this year. But shortly afterwards, that when Brittany Ferries confirmed it has secured a conflicting time slot, this resulted in DFDS being moved to a different slot to the original one proposed. Could you explain the process that resulted in this outcome?
In what outcome?
So can you confirm that if that's the correct...
Yeah, but I think that's the point I'm making, is that a media story you're reading from?
No, I don't think so. So could you explain whether DFDS was able to secure the slots? I mean, I think that's the information we've also received.
DFDS has secured the 7:30 slot out of Saint-Malo.
Out of Saint-Malo?
Yeah, until I think it's the end of March. And there's further discussions ongoing with the port.
And what about sailings from Jersey to Saint-Malo? Do we know what
They
times?
will then come in, turn it around and
the
go
other
back.
way. So
I think it's interesting, and I remember this from 10 years ago when Condor were operating services. Again, so not a criticism of Condor at all. This is very much about the tension between islanders' desires for day trips and ultimately the economy's benefit from incoming visitors. And so there has always been a tension between the time the vessel starts in Saint-Malo and obviously the time it can therefore turn around and leave Jersey. And I think 7:30 is pretty much the sweet spot because any earlier, if you're leaving Saint-Malo earlier than 7:30, then passengers in Saint-Malo have to start to get up at very, very early times, kind of 5 a.m. in order to get to the boat and wait 40 minutes and all the rest of it. If you leave it later in Saint-Malo, then obviously you're really knocking out any chance of a day trip. With a 7:30 slot will, to me, that creates the best balance that we can get. There will always be that tension. Ultimately, last year, because of delays in the tender process, yes, it meant that DFDS were at a disadvantage, but I believe Saint-Malo is a commercial port. It needs passengers. Jersey is, outside of the UK destinations, Jersey is its biggest destination in the Channel Islands. And so St Malo needs those passengers to flow in and out of its port. And so I think St Malo values the Jersey service, and as a result, we see a 7:30 slot as a really good place.
The question that arises from that, I suppose, the first one is the island authority, I understand, has to have some input into the scheduling. Is that correct in terms of
to ensure that it's compliant with the concession agreement? Yes, yeah.
And has there been any thought to actually what consultation might be done or might have been done in deciding what time boats should leave from Jersey? But also, in fact, the other big feedback we're getting is not so much the time that boats are leaving, but it's actually the length of time it takes to get from Jersey to St Malo, which I understand this year is going to be 1 hour 55. That seems to be unacceptably long for a lot of Jersey people.
What do you think it was? And I ask this as a genuine question. What do we think it was previously?
I recall it. I mean, I know, Minister, you worked for Condor, so did I for a brief while.
I was never employed by Condor.
Never employed, but okay. I worked for Condor. And I certainly remember, but even recently, that an hour was standard, an hour 5, an hour 30 would have seemed...
I remember an hour 30.
An hour 30 would have seemed like a long time, but I think more recently, and when you get to 2 hours, we're getting complaints that it's taking people an hour to get off the boat. You've then got a queue at for your passports.
Yeah.
And that by the time, especially if it's a day trip, but if you're travelling on later in the evening, you have to then stay in St Malo, so that's incurring extra costs. I mean, do you have any concerns?
So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Apologies. I've travelled to St Malo many times over the past year on the boat. It's been pretty much 1 hour 50 to 2 hours every single time. My understanding, I don't remember it being an hour and 5 or an hour and 10. I remember it being an hour and a half. My understanding for the decisions are twofold. One is ultimately it's more efficient, and so you are reducing costs for that, but also you're reducing...
In what way?
As in you're using less fuel. So as with any engine, there are cruising speeds which give you the best efficiency, fuel used versus performance and speed. And so the 29 knots is pretty much where they want to be for that. It reduces emissions and it also reduces fuel, but it also protects the engines. And we have seen in the past with high-speed craft that engines can go.
They're already quite old engines, I think.
And but this is why we're getting a new vessel.
Are they sailing on 3 engines instead of 4?
They have done. I believe they're sailing on 4 at the moment. I mean, don't hold me to this.
They've just done a full engine replacement on the Tarifa jet over the dry docking period. So
I think, again, this is where, there is a lot. I understand that change is uncomfortable for people.
I mean, the Chief Minister is also saying that he doesn't find it acceptable that the ferries are so slow to France.
It's fine for the Chief Minister. And, but this is a long-term contract with long-term aims. And so the performance in the first year is very important. The types of boats they are using is important. But ultimately, when we talk about an older boat, that will be replaced by the end of 2028 with a brand new boat. That was something we couldn't have before. We did not have any promises of, previous to going to a tender process. So before going to a tender process, we had no promises about any investment in new fleet. And it is difficult in the political world because people are understandably focused on today. But we do have to look at the long-term picture, and what we have done here is secure new vessels. That won't be a vessel that's bought second-hand from somebody else. It will be a brand new vessel designed entirely for these waters that it is to serve.
So can we talk about today? So in terms of the scheduling options, is there an opportunity to sit down with the FTS and say to them, from your point of view, we'd like to maybe look at different times that work better? If it is the case that more French tourists are going to Guernsey, not to Jersey, and then actually there's still that high demand for an improved efficiency can be seen from 2 ways. It might be more fuel efficient to run at a slow speed, but it's less time efficient maybe for Jersey people travelling on to other destinations who then have to stay in accommodation in St Malo. Is there an opportunity to revisit the scheduling and to have an input to be flexible to the feedback that you're getting?
There's only, yes, always listen to feedback. I think we are kind of caught. It would be very difficult for a boat to leave St Malo earlier. Okay, it would be really difficult for that to happen.
But it could leave
because that
Jersey.
would-
We could do it the other way around. It could leave Jersey earlier and then come back from St Malo
But
later.
the St
on.
Malo, it stays overnight in St Malo. There are various reasons for that. Condor does exactly the same. It stays overnight in St Malo, so it starts in St Malo in the morning. So that is your starting point. It then comes here, it turns around as quickly as possible and goes back again to St Malo. That ultimately, that cannot change in terms of that's the way the routing works. Yes, they could push the French start time to 6:30 a.m., but you will lose large amounts of French tourists that way. And so it's a balance. And I do
answer the
think
question,
7:30 is about the right balance.
But to answer the question, is it possible to revisit the scheduling to ask the FTS to put on faster ferries as well?
Yeah, in fact, I've had that conversation with them recently about, please, can you bring down this, can you speed it up for another 10 minutes, even just another 10 minutes, something like this. So that is something we do ask. But again, it is limited by the capacity of the vessels. Sure. And so the vessels have to be able to do that. And, the vessels travel, I believe, at 29 knots or thereabouts. The journey, every time I've done it, has been very smooth and very good. I really hope as we go into the year ahead that islanders will see the benefit of the timings for their day trips to France. I think what we should see this year is better day trips to France for islanders. That's the big thing that I've wanted, and I believe we will get that this year.
Thank you. For Jersey Islanders.
For Jersey Islanders.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to move on to the concession agreement and contractual obligations. So, Minister, that's question 7 for our reference panel. Minister, in their submission, the Jersey Farmers Union stated that unfortunately before the concession was awarded, no consultation with stakeholders took place, leading to unnecessary misunderstandings on a number of immediate course corrections being necessary. Could you provide any comment on this?
I don't know exactly what they're, in the sense I don't know what course corrections they're talking about exactly.
Okay, so let's not focus on the course corrections, but let's focus on the consultation. Was there consultation that took place with the Jersey Farmers Union in Jersey before scheduling was talked about?
I don't think there was, actually. I don't think there was particularly, and I think that's one takeaway from this exercise is I will put my hands up and say I don't think we got all the consultation right around the tender. I think, just quickly, you can tell us in the set as what consultation did happen, but I think it is somewhere that we've learned. Certainly I've learned. But I think you can consult in advance of the tender for the types of things that you want in that tender process. I don't think it's possible to take partners such as the Jersey Farmers Union or retailers or anybody else into actually awarding that tender. I think that's where their own commercial interests start to trump, kind of government
I get that.
interests.
So I think at this stage,
I think there is,
I think we're not talking about the tender award. We're
talking.
talking about the contract and the scheduling and the SLAs.
Did Rich just want to say?
No, the point I was going to make is the freight rotations are largely unchanged. In fact, if anything, they have much more freight capacity available to them now than ever before. So, in terms of consultation, there's continuity of the freight schedule. The previous contract had 5 RoRo and 5 RoPax as the minimum requirement for Condor. We now have 6 RoRo and 5 RoPax as the minimum requirement for DFDS. So there's actually an additional sailing each week as a minimum contractual requirement than existed before.
Did Condor always only run 5 and 5, or did
I'm
they?
talking about the contractual requirements. DFDS may run additional sailings if it's commercially viable to do so.
Yeah.
Clearly running freight for one island is more questionable in terms of whether it's commercially viable or not.
I was just going to ask, we've had a lot of feedback about the cancellation of the Tuesday freight boats. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so that again shows how there's always the ability to talk with these people, which is really good. And I think, again, this is a learning point from my perspective, and I've passed it on to Richard and officers. And, there was, from the FDS's perspective, there was a need to adjust the service because of the financial requirements, the overcapacity in terms of freight, etc. But what I've said needs to happen now is that actually when they identify something that needs to change, the first step is to go and consult with stakeholders. When you've got the stakeholders in the right place, then bring the suggested change to government, and then having seen that the stakeholders in the round are happy with that, we can go ahead. The mistake this time, and I hold my hands up, was that DFDS came to us with that. I think it seemed like an understandable kind of change from our perspective, and I asked them to go and consult afterwards. What I've said now is I want that to be the other way around, so that consultation is done first, and therefore impacts are minimised, whatever the change may be, whether it's a price rise or a schedule change, whatever it may be. What I'm really pleased with is that as a result of the concerns is that the FDS have reached out to stakeholders, and they're coming back with a new proposal, as I understand it, that will help those stakeholders who are most affected by it. So again, it shows the listening and the learning. You know, I'm not going to pretend I've done this contract before, if you know what I mean. This is the first time, so I am learning as I go, but where I see places for me to learn, and hopefully, you know, that whoever the next minister is to learn from any mistakes that I've made, that's the right thing to do. And so I think we're in a much better place for those sorts of changes in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow on from that, I think what we've heard is that there have been some unintended consequences to that. Can you give us some confidence around the consultation process that you enter into? Do they talk about the downsides and the risks to manage expectations? Because it seems that some of the feedback is that people feel they've been promised a lot and that there has not been that experience coming through. Yeah. So we just want to understand in pure consultation terms, rather than trying to just sell the benefits of what is it, is there a realistic engagement with the public about what the downsides are and what the risks are to some of the ways in which you have to operate within some of the constraints that you've got at the moment?
Yeah, I think, how can I say this? I think we perhaps need to structure ongoing consultation to make sure that there is that ongoing consultation with the public and with key stakeholders. I mean, that is part of the FDS's work on their own NPS scores, etc. They do take that information, they then share it with us to show what customers are saying. You have to deal in generalities. You know, if I today have been put out and I'm not happy about it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the other 100 people who sail today are not happy about it, but I am likely to be very miffed, and because I've been put out, particularly by this. And so we do have to look at the overall picture and not necessarily always at individual issues. As I've just said to the chair, I think I am learning about that consultation. I mean, again, I have to go back to, there was so often no consultation with the previous operator, not even with government, let alone with the operators. We were on the receiving end of things rather than, what we can do now is change our approach, talk with the FDS regularly about what the best approach is. And that's exactly what we were doing. And so that Tuesday sailing is a really good example where I understood, hold on a sec, when this was brought to my attention in October, I should have, and this is the hard thing about this job, is you realise after the fact how you could have done it better. And so that's why I said, actually, from now on, when there's a service change, do the consultation first, then come to government and suggest the service change and show us what the consultation is, why the consultation has led you to that view rather than any other view. And that's just a bit of learning on my part.
It does say in the concession agreement that there is quite a lot of control with the operator. I mean, do you foresee any concerns around the amount of control the operator has, even though you have a good relationship with them and you are driving improved performance?
I would argue it's less.
Would they always have the autonomy to make the decision, or would they always have the final say in the decisions around how the operations are running?
And I understand why there is a final say in that respect, but I can't tell you how much better the contract is in terms of that consultation with us as with anyone else. Previously, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but previously there was, consultation would be at best a letter telling us what was going to happen. That's not the case now. It is a case where, even in any given scenario where something is to be changed, we can sit down and at the very least challenge them as to why that is the right change. Ultimately, I understand why there is a final say on their part in certain areas, and that's because of the investment that they're making. They cannot come out of a £300 million commitment having not received the funding to help provide that £300 million investment commitment. So I do understand that. They're the ones with that financial liability, not us. and that's part of the contract, is the financial liability for investment rests with the FDS. It doesn't rest with the government of Jersey or the people of Jersey. And so I do understand why they've got to have that protection.
We did have in the previous operating agreement with Condor, Condor's chief executive coming along and saying that's the schedule, and that's the schedule. There's no discussion. That's what we're doing. That's what we have to do, because they were an organisation driven by essentially their commitments onwards to being a heavily indebted company, and had to deliver a schedule that was purely efficient for them, with no regard necessarily to the operating agreement. And the operating agreement as was pretty toothless in terms of enforceability as well, when things did go wrong, when it really mattered. You never hope to have to use the full powers in these agreements. There are plenty of powers in the concession agreement should that need ever arise. But the quality of the dialogue that we're having now with the FDS is just light years away from that which we had before with the previous operator. The other point I think around scheduling is we have those 6 dedicated freight sailings every day. That's supplemented by the 5 RoPac sailings. In DFDS making a decision to remove the Tuesday sailing, they've looked at volumes over the course of the week and assessed that to be the one that had the minimal impact. And that doesn't mean no one's impacted. It just means that's what they've assessed to be the minimal impact. And of course, that's then created some noise. I don't doubt that in any solution they come forward with, there will also be some noise. And one of those that's complaining about it seems to have easily adapted to having no evening arrivals at all in the other island, and how that affects their retail operations and stocking over there. So it's very odd that we're seeing the criticism just in one island for the fact that one evening sailing has been taken out.
We have vastly more freight sailings and freight capacity than Guernsey does.
Right.
Far more.
Guernsey is a smaller place, I suppose.
It is.
Can I ask? I think there's a concern in people's minds that and I think we'd all agree this is that this is not the optimal way to run a ferry. This isn't what anyone wanted. But I think the intention was always to have one ferry operator between 2 islands to drive efficiencies and to have, for whether it's for tourism or for freight. We don't have that. And that when we see reactive things like reducing a freight sailing which previously existed, and also ferries going slow because it's supposedly efficient, but maybe it's also to save money, that does start to bring into question, and it's reflected in some of the submissions, the viability of the 20-year contract, and whether or not actually enough money can be made by DFDS in a reduced marketplace to actually wash its face. Is that something which you have concerns about? Is it something which is future-proofed in the agreement to allow for a break clause if either party, for example, sees that this is no longer working? What would the circumstances be, and how would it operate if we wanted to revisit or break the contract?
So a key part of the tender process was the financial resilience of the operator, and the FDS won that aspect of the tender hands down from Condor Ferries, and therefore DFDS has been awarded the contract. So we have that financial resilience. But equally, they're not a charity, so the routes they operate have to be profitable. And in the case of Jersey, to support the level of investment that's being looked at over the 20 years, has to be creating the revenues and the profitability that justifies that level of capital being employed back into the business. And I'm not sure that's widely understood in a public sense, that any investment only comes from surplus profits, typically, in terms of being sustainable and resilient in the long term.
We understand. I think most people do understand that, but what's the first casualty, if you like, of non-profitability? Is it going to be the reinvestment in the fleet? Is that what you see as the...
So there are lots of aspects.
I don't think it's possible to actually answer that question in the sense of if that were to be brought to us.
I think Richard was about to answer.
No, okay, well, I'm jumping in. If that were to be brought to us as an issue, this is not financially viable, this contract isn't working, that discussion would happen then. I could not preempt what levers would be pulled. That's why I was kind of like, there's no way I can sit here
There's so many
today
variables.
And what I mean is though
that this would be the answer at some unknown future event.
Yeah, but the upgrade of the fleet is presumably conditional, and there's a caveat on profitability. Is that correct?
Well, it's clearly in the contract.
That's right.
Yeah, so we expect a level of investment. And there are levers within the contract that says if financial performance isn't there, then we have to look at scheduling, fares, we have to look at the level of investment, because the whole thing's a package. You know, if you think of this as a box that has a fixed volume within the box, it can either be a tall, thin box, it can be a short, stubby box, but the bottom line is it still has to have the same volume. So you can change the proportions, but it still has to fit the same amount in. And that's really where we are. There's some flexibility in the contract to be able to adjust things over time. So, for example, the new high-speed craft, we would be looking at that to be faster than the one that's in place at the moment. There'll be different technologies in terms of propulsion that changes the cost model underneath, hopefully to a more efficient model. So there are lots of factors that can change over time, and what we've tried to do with the concession agreement is build in sufficient flexibility for that to be able to change over time, and to ensure that we've got the visibility from the operator of exactly what is happening in real time. We had no visibility of the previous operator before in a financial sense, until we actually got a letter from them saying we need £40 million, we're going to need it in the next month, otherwise services are at risk.
Could I just follow that through, Richard? So what is your plan around the pricing policy? Are you going to regularly and routinely review that
We review every quarter.
approach? Every quarter?
Every quarter for compliance with the contract.
Okay, so again, managing expectations is that that could result in increased prices or reductions in prices for people who use the ferry service, both for freight and passenger service.
So if we remove the requirement to invest 300 million, remove that altogether, then you fundamentally change the pricing dynamics of the whole contract. But then what you do is you place significant risk on the resilience of Lifeline services, because what you're saying is for the next 20 years, we can have a very old, clapped out fleet and just praying that it comes in every morning with the essential supplies that the island needs to stock the shelves. That's a very big gamble. Mm-hmm. So the reality is it's somewhere in between. You've got to create a service that's competitive for islanders that want to get away, competitive for visitors that want to come, but also competitive and resilient to provide the Lifeline services that we need in terms of freight as well. And it's a complicated cocktail to try and blend. The concession agreement tries to bring all of those factors together and gives us a space to move those dynamics over the life of the contract without it breaking. And it has a process that if we disagree, you can clearly see how we would disagree and how we would then look to a resolution of that situation. But the most important aspect, which isn't in the contract, is the currency of the relationship. And as the Minister's referenced, the quality of the dialogue that we enjoy with them at all levels of the group around day-to-day operations and their commitment to deliver the service that islanders want.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chair. Minister, before me I have the connectivity concession agreement. I just wanted your view, 1 year on from the agreement being signed, whether there is any parts of the agreement that you feel maybe remain inadequate, or if there's maybe areas that are not part of the agreement that potentially should be part of the agreement in the future.
I think, and I still don't think it could ever have been part of this agreement, because this is for Jersey only service, but something stronger on inter-island.
Yeah.
There's no question. The one thing I still feel is missing, and kind of every day I feel it, is that inter-island part, inter-island car ferry sailing. I am really pleased, speaking to DFDS in the last couple of days, is that they are going to be presenting a proposal. Well, they've now told us what the proposal is for a Friday evening sailing from Jersey to Guernsey and then on to Portsmouth, and then a Monday sailing, I can't remember if it was morning or evening, but from Portsmouth to Guernsey, then on to Jersey, using the Stena Vinga. And so that proposal will go forward. We're really pleased with that.
Okay.
That will go forward to Guernsey, and I hope Guernsey can look favourably upon that as well. But that's the proposal as I've been briefed.
Just a very quick question. Will they be able to pick up passengers in Guernsey?
No. So it'll be passengers from Jersey going into Guernsey. It won't be able to collect in Guernsey to carry on northbound. And then on the Monday return, it won't be able to drop passengers into Guernsey. It will only be able to pick up in Guernsey to bring passengers back to Jersey.
I mean, this
so
is
only the inter-island functions.
But only the ones that are booked to go over. They can't pick up new customers.
No, that's to protect, because I totally understand.
Yeah.
And my the previous president of the Economic Development Committee in Guernsey made it very clear to me on more than one occasion that he was, as far as inter-island services were concerned, he was always worried about leakage. Yeah. So, exactly, DFDS picking up Brittany Ferries passengers to take them to Portsmouth. That would obviously reduce Brittany Ferries returns in Guernsey, and that would be an impact for them. I totally understand that concern. So the only way inter-island can work is that, DFDS can't be marketing to take people from Guernsey to Portsmouth for that leg, because that would be harming Brittany ferries and that would be inappropriate. And so, no, it is very much just that inter-island bit. And similarly, freight can't pass through, you can't kind of transship via Jersey to get it to Guernsey. It has to be Jersey originating freight going to Guernsey. That's something that, the previous economic development president in Guernsey was very clear that he was worried about, was about this leakage. And so I want to honour their concerns, because I don't want to hurt their contracts in any way at all. So, it will just be inter-island in that respect for the actual travelling passengers.
And obviously, when we had the Chief Executive Officer of the FDS come before the panel, we spoke about the impact of the under-21s Marathi. And obviously some businesses mentioned about how they were struggling to then export. So just with this new arrangement that has been proposed, is there going to be any impact on freight, or is it going to be absolutely fine because actually it's going to Guernsey and then heading to the UK?
I mean, it shouldn't have any real measurable impact. So one of the problems with this year, and the reason that the FDS ultimately didn't do many inter-island sailings, was because they'd been put in a situation where the only vessel they could really use was the Tarifa jet. That was, I mean, this is quite simply down to cost, etc. They were basically losing up to 700 French passengers and bringing over kind of 20 passengers for inter-island. So the losses were enormous. And therefore the cost to Jersey, to the contract, was enormous. By using the Stena Vinga, which does the long leg between here and Portsmouth, pulling into Guernsey one direction and back into Guernsey in the other direction, not taking Guernsey it absolutely reduces the costs from a DFDS perspective enormously, and reduces the impact on Jersey's own tourism industry.
How long does that add to the journey?
I think it's about 2.5 hours.
So what's the total length of the...
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but what I do know is it will end up being exactly the same as it has been in Jersey for many years. So, the previous incumbent always used to do Jersey, Guernsey, Portsmouth, Portsmouth, Guernsey, Jersey. So it'll be doing exactly the same as that. On the overnight sailing from Jersey to Portsmouth, that's actually not very much impacted at all, because the boat gets there quite early already. And so I do believe it will be pulling into Portsmouth at the same time, or thereabouts, about 6 a.m. I think it will still be pulling into Portsmouth at that time. I haven't seen the times to know whether...
The bottom line is everything's a compromise. So if you want more, you're not going to go and charter a vessel just to do inter-island. So it has to be a compromise. You either lose French rotations, or you have an extra couple of hours on the journey going northbound. But worst case scenario with this Friday, Monday solution is that on those 2 days, the Friday evening northbound and the Monday southbound, you're back to the crossing times that we used to have under the previous contract.
Can I just ask, Minister, are the Guernsey authorities, such as your counterpart, aware of this proposal, or
not that I'm aware of at the moment, but obviously I want to kind of fast forward it to them so we can get it approved at their end as quickly as possible.
There's a potential issue about lack of capacity in there. So if you're taking it, if it's peak times and you've got a full boat and you're having to take car passengers that are only going Jersey to Guernsey, and you can't pick any up in Guernsey, you're potentially losing out on a lot of revenue.
Well, the FDS are satisfied there's adequate capacity. As I said, there's plenty of lane meters of capacity on the RoPax and Ro-Ro services. So for that RoPax sailing, they're satisfied there's adequate capacity. And the demand for inter-island sailings is very, very modest.
And what does it do for freight in between the islands? One of the issues we're having is that you can't get freight between the islands easily.
Well, there are low sailings between the islands, so that you can get freight between the islands. But in terms of Brittany Ferries is doing a weekly rotation, the FDS will now also have a weekly rotation in place as well.
You can get low, but that's not with the FDS.
No, it's with other
Because
operators.
like channel shipping and so on.
I mean, so Brittany Ferries do Wednesday sailings today. If the Friday and Monday sailings go ahead, then you will have inter-island sailings 3 days a week, Friday, Monday, Wednesday.
But there won't be day trips.
There was day trips with Aurigny, and there would have been also with Loganair as well.
And Islands Unlimited.
And if
But
Islands
not for
Unlimited come onto the
vehicles, so you can
routes.
go for a sporting event, for example, or take the minibus.
No.
only on the weekend
No.
potentially?
No,
and
but
come
you
back
can,
on
I
Monday?
mean, the point there is, and we know, because, I really do feel for people who want to go to dog shows in Guernsey, and people who want to go to horse shows, and people who want to do motorsport, and vice versa. And But this way, you'll be able to travel out on the Monday for your event on the Saturday. Sorry, travel out on the Friday for event on the Saturday or Sunday, and come back on the Monday with your horse, with your dogs, with your cars, or your motorbikes. I think so. The Friday and the Monday, to me, makes a lot of sense for that weekend sporting events and community event situation. I think Thomas wanted to say something.
No, just to pick up on the chair's question there. So we raised the capacity planning point with DFDS at the most recent monitoring committee, and they're satisfied, and we're satisfied that they can properly balance that capacity demand. So if there was, if they had foresight on there being greater demand to reach the UK, reach Portsmouth from Jersey, they can build in booking capacity accordingly to ensure that's properly reflective and balanced.
Do you envisage that if this were to become established in reciprocal, that there might actually be a quid pro quo where Guernsey and Jersey might say, actually, you can take on you can take on board passengers as long as it's reciprocal?
I think that's a development which would be
limited.
worth looking at.
Yeah.
I mean, again, in order to, and I am, from the top of my head here, this isn't anything I've discussed previously, but, we see on airlines code sharing, so to speak, and I don't know a lot about code sharing, but I assume money follows that to some extent as well. Could we get to a situation where revenues are shared on that inter-island bit, which then takes away the fear of that competition? I don't know. It's possible. We'll see where we go. But again, we'll be open to any conversations on that front. The FDS, I imagine, will be open. They may have objections. I don't know. Brittany Ferries may have objections. I don't know. But these things are always open for discussion. I can understand that there might be solutions, as you suggest, Chair, which...
Thank you, Minister. Look, I think we're at the end of our allotted time. There are still some questions remaining, which we can probably submit to you via writing, if that's okay. So unless there's any